Hey everyone, this is Joanne Dunbar, and I am doing my Module 6 discussion post, which I gotta say is going to be a challenge to get everything in just a few minutes time because I felt like there was so much content to go through for this module, and there were so many things that I came across that I felt like I could talk about in this discussion post, but I'm going to just try to hit the really key important points and kind of touch on my own experiences as I discuss the different readings and video for this chapter, or for this module. Question 1 is, what special difficulties do struggling writers face, and how might these be overcome? So chapter 13 in our textbook kind of touches on the different difficulties that writers can face, or struggling writers can face, and I will say that I have encountered a lot of these throughout my teaching of writing. One thing that really stuck with me was on page 444 of the gunning text. It mentioned many students will be stuck on the knowledge-telling process, in which writing is similar to telling a story orally or providing an oral explanation. And it goes on to explain many students who aren't comfortable with writing will not stray beyond the basic process of any prompt or stimulus that they receive and are asked to write about. They cannot get any more creative than simply telling about, I think that this is happening in this picture, or this picture is about blah blah blah. I saw that, I know, in my own student who I'm tutoring for this class. When we did the writing lesson, I was trying to get her to write a story in response to a couple of different interesting pictures that I showed her, and she could not seem to get beyond exactly that, the knowledge telling. This picture reminds me of when I went on vacation. When I was on vacation, we did this and this and this, and that reminds me of the picture. Or there was another one where I told her specifically, write a story from the perspective of one of the two animals in the picture, and she didn't. She just told about what was happening in the picture. I think that the cat is reaching into the fish bowl because it saw the fish and it wanted the fish. So that's something that you see a lot in writers who struggle. A lot of other problems have to do with the writing process and just blocks to students' mental capacities or their organizational capacities in attending to different parts of the writing process. A lot of students struggle with things like revising and editing. Once they read it, they're done with it. One intervention that can help with both the creative side and then the writing process side is the writing workshop. So there's a few different ways to carry out the writing workshop, but basically it consists of a series of very structured procedures in which students have a mini lesson and then a lot of time to work on their individual writing. Then a lot of collaboration, both with peers and with you as the teacher, is involved. To be honest with you, having taught language arts, this is my 4th year teaching language arts, and I've never been able to utilize this model because we do PLCs, and I'm usually the newer one, 4th year teacher here, so still fairly young. I'm usually the newer one coming into a set of established plans, and I have yet to encounter a PLC or a team of teachers who have implemented the writing workshop model. There are just too many, I think, there's too many standards to cover, too much standardized test prep to do, and so writing workshop is kind of not something that's really done in the schools that I've worked in. But it's definitely based on set procedures and a lot of conferencing, both peer conferencing and then teacher-student conferencing, and then special or explicit instruction but only in small amounts and then followed by some independent work time to write. I learned a lot about the writing workshop in one of my previous courses for this program. We read Ralph Fletcher's book about the writing workshop, and so that gave me a lot of theoretical knowledge of how it works, but I still don't have a lot of hands-on. I wanted to pull a couple of things from a couple of the other resources in talking about interventions for writers and things to keep in mind when you're helping students become better writers. Self-efficacy was mentioned both in the Julian article and the video, the Reading Rockets video from Dr. Steve Graham. Writing is one of those things that's very closely tied to students' self-efficacy. And that is basically their picture or their opinion, their idea of themselves and their own abilities that's in their mind. And just from my experiences and my readings that I've done, it seems that writing can be more tied to students' self-efficacy than a lot of other disciplines. Just because when you write, it's like you're taking thoughts from your brain and putting them down on paper. So there's something kind of very personal that's tied to that. And so when we give feedback to students, we need to make sure that we are not harming their self-concept. And that's something that's a little bit more vulnerable when we're giving feedback on writing. Especially when the student, I would say, is sharing something more personal, but even if it's like expository writing, we are taking their own words that they have crafted and we are giving them feedback. And so one thing that I learned in one of my previous courses for this program, the one where we read Ralph Fletcher's book, and have really tried to put into practice in my own language arts class, is when I give feedback to a student, I make sure to really focus on the positives, and that's another thing that Steve Graham mentions in his video. Really focus on the positives, and then the negatives you want to frame in a positive light. So the way that I do that is when I'm giving feedback on a piece of writing from a student, I say, I really liked the way you did this and this and this. And no matter what it is, I try really hard to find something positive that I can mention about the student's writing. And then from there I say, next time, or to make this better, you could try XYZ. So I put it that way, rather than being, saying something like, this writing suffers from blah, 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 or you did XYZ, you did this wrong, you did blah, 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 you did blah, blah, blah. So kind of framing it in that more positive light, because if a student feels as though all that's going to come from them writing is critique, they will eventually give up and only give the minimal required effort. So that's something that's really important. Another thing that I wanted to mention from the Julian article, this is on page 665, I really liked what it said about novel opportunities. It talks about the Vygotsky zone of proximal development, and it mentions a wide variety of novel writing activities and novel writing tools, e.g. funky pens, manual typewriters, would contribute to emergent writers' motivation. And motivation is something else that I want to touch on in a second, that both the video from Dr. Steve Graham and this article touch on, or really hit on heavily. I have students, girls in particular, who have this fascination, and as a creative person myself, I honestly can relate, a fascination with using lots of different colored pens. For a while it was the Flair pens, now it's the Tombow brush pens, and that will cause them, actually, in my experience, to do more writing when they get to write with the fun pens than they would otherwise. And I know that there are a lot of teachers out there that don't like that, and they have their reasons, and that's fine. They might want students to write in a number 2 pencil every time. Me personally, I know that I remember when I was in school, I loved the process of writing things down, by hand. And I would do crazy stuff, like I would experiment with different kinds of handwritings, and I would think, what if I changed the way that I wrote my A? And I would practice while I was doing things like taking notes in class and writing my spelling words. And I would, from this article and my own experiences, I would dare to say that it's a good idea to let students do those things, because through those different avenues that increase engagement and motivation, whether or not they realize it, they are practicing the disciplines that we want them to learn more. So I really appreciated that they touched on that. That also reminds me, and this is a bit of a rabbit trail, but I think it also is relevant. Currently I'm reading The Bullet Journal Method by Ryder Carroll. And some of you might be familiar with bullet journaling. If you look it up on Pinterest, you'll see a lot of really fancy, creative, scrapbooky stuff. But this guy, Ryder Carroll, and he has a TED Talk that's fabulous. In his book, he invented the method of bullet journaling, which is basically an organizational system for tracking your habits and your goals and your to-dos and your life, basically organizing your life on paper. And he kind of breaks down the reasons why there is value in writing things by hand, not in digital format. Obviously, we're living in a very digitalized age. So we want to teach students those technology skills. But that does not mean that the process of writing things out is completely obsolete. And if there's a student who is brought to a greater level of organization or even just understanding of the writing process through the practice of writing something by hand, then I would say that there's definite value in that. Moving on to one more note about motivation, because that seems to be something that comes up a good bit. And I could talk forever about this, but I'll keep it brief. Also in Dr. Graham's Reading Rockets video, I loved the anecdote that he shared that was about the computer game. And I don't even remember which one it was at this point. I just checked again. It's Xena the Warrior Princess. And she, through that experience of playing that, she became heightened awareness. She gained a heightened awareness of her deficiencies in spelling. So from her motivation to be able to effectively communicate with other people on that online game, she raised her spelling level a lot that year, or that summer. And that just kind of reminded me of, he called it kind of a fluke, but I don't think we have to think of it as a fluke. If we can somehow harness the power of, sometimes I call it tricking students into learning, but kind of leading them by way of what motivates them into learning in ways that they would not otherwise. I was teaching my students text structures, informational text structures, a couple weeks ago, and they were doing a project. And a lot of the students just took off with the project. They were supposed to creatively come up with a lot of different demonstrations of the different organizational text structures for nonfiction. I had one student, he just wants to sit there all the time and do nothing. And so he was doing that, and I went over to him and I said, you know, what is the brain block that you're having? And he was like, well, I just don't know what to write. And I said, do you understand the organizational text structures? And he said, yeah, I just don't know what to write about. And he was supposed to come up with an example of each one. And so I said, well, we need to figure out a topic that you're interested in. I happen to know this student is an avid Fortnite player. I teach middle school. Most of the boys are, let's be honest. And I knew that. And so I was like, okay, so I know you like playing Fortnite. So if you could tell people about Fortnite using the text structures, let's take one. Sequence. You want to teach somebody how to do a certain task on Fortnite. Step 1, you do this. And I told him, I kept reiterating this. I am a nerdy teacher. I'm old. I don't know about Fortnite. And so you're going to have to tell me, because I can't tell you step 1, I don't even know what you're going to be explaining, but you're going to explain something to me about how you do something in Fortnite. Step 1, what do you do? Step 2, what do you do? Okay? Compare and contrast. You're going to take two different things and you're going to tell me in Fortnite what's similar about them and what's different. And as other students hear me saying these things, and I'm kind of really trying to emphasize, like, oh, I'm clueless about this. You're gonna have to bridge the gap, because I don't know what's in Fortnite, because I really don't. But other students start getting ideas. Oh, you could compare and contrast this and this. What's another one? Chronological. That's telling a story. And I'm like, tell a story about something that happened in Fortnite. First this happened, then this happened. And you could see the wheels turning for him when I started doing that. And that was something that just kind of came to me out of the blue. But I think that kind of harnesses that principle of, we want to take the things that students are already interested in and use that as kind of a gateway to learning. Real quick, I'm going to touch on the second question, which is, what are the overall essential components of a program for struggling readers and writers? So there was a lot of content in our textbook about this, and I'm just going to try to touch on it real briefly. So it kind of some of the programs that I've been exposed to, Read 180. When I was in SPED, I taught Read 180, and it can be effective. It's very research backed, but at the same time there are some gaps. So the book talks about RTI, which is kind of like the gold standard of intervention in public education. I will say from my experience that RTI often is not implemented with fidelity. It's kind of just a box to be checked off in a lot of schools. And it's not something that I've got a lot of faith in, just because I have not seen it be super effective in helping students. However, when I read about it and all of the goals and the components of it, I'm not convinced that it's being implemented with fidelity. I'm not convinced that teachers have enough support to effectively monitor and implement strategies. And I'm not convinced that there's enough accountability either for students to report back, for teachers to report back on their findings. But that is one thing that is listed as far as intervention. Reading recovery is something that I don't have a lot of experience with firsthand, but the textbook does mention it. It defines it on page 479 as the goal of reading recovery is to accelerate struggling first graders' progress by providing intensive one-on-one instruction 30 minutes a day, 5 days a week for 12 to 20 weeks. And so it kind of breaks down the components of reading recovery. There's the reading of familiar books that you start out with. So that's to kind of build the student's fluency and confidence. And then rereading of a previous day's book. So the more the student is able to read it, the more confident they're able to get, and you take a running record. Isolated letter and word work. And this teacher and student build words together, and there's magnetic letters and a metal board involved. Writing a story, so that kind of integrates the reading and writing components. Assembling a cut-up story. So then a story that's familiar to the child, either by being written by them or read previously, is cut up and the student has to reassemble, so kind of developing their sequencing skills, and then reading a new book. So that's a popular intervention program for early in elementary schools. And the textbook, early elementary students. The textbook breaks down a lot of different intervention programs that obviously I can't go through all of them. But basically it then goes on to kind of break down the different components that need to be involved in a successful reading intervention program. So there should always be some type of diagnostic assessment, because that's going to give you baseline data. Instruction on a one-to-one basis or in small groups of 3 to 5. So you'll see that some in elementary schools with the early intervention program. Or I was a Title I tutor prior to getting my first full-time teaching job, and I would pull groups of 3 to 5 students and work on reading skills with them. I really enjoyed that too. Focusing on those five components of reading, so phonological awareness and decoding and phonics and vocabulary and all those things. Focusing on sight words, word building, reading and rereading of books, and having books that reinforce concepts that have been taught. Comprehension strategies, word analysis, so focusing on breaking down the words, the Latin roots, sounding out letter by letter, chunking the words, reading one-on-one with peers or teachers, giving students ample time to read independently. That's something that I still try to implement a lot of in my classroom. Giving students opportunities to write, so kind of putting their reading skills into a different context by writing. Involve parents, so making sure that students have parental support. That's something that's big. One thing I see with my niece, my niece is in kindergarten, and my brother, her dad, reads with her every night, and that's part of her homework, and he makes sure that she does her homework first thing when she gets home from school. She does the reading, she does her sight words, she reads a story, and I think it's really cool to see him sit down with her and do that. And then make sure to provide ongoing monitoring, keeping running records and other types of progress monitoring. Make sure the program is structured. That was one thing that was very helpful when I taught Read 180, was that there was a set procedure every day. I didn't have to reteach routines because it was the same thing every day. So I would have the rotations on the board. Students would look at it and they would immediately know which station they were going to be at, and we didn't have a lot of questions or what do I do here, where do I go? They knew where to look, they knew what each station was, and they knew what to do when they got there. And then making sure to build vocabulary, background knowledge, and then do some follow-up diagnostic tracking as well, just so you can keep data on how effective different interventions have been. So that's just a real quick rundown of different components of reading intervention. So I try to keep this brief. I feel like there's so much more I could say, but hopefully this is a good real quick summary and analysis, and I hope everyone's doing well. I know I just had my spring break, so I'm very refreshed and I'm ready to go into the home stretch, and I hope everyone's feeling the same way, and that we finish the semester out strong. I look forward to reading and watching others' responses. Have a great weekend.